Yo, what's going on, everybody? It is Straight Out of Boston here, and today I'm back with a little bit of a different OOTP video today. I am showing off my Oakland Athletics save that I have referenced a handful of times in my New York Mets Dynasty that I'm currently posting. And yeah, I asked a couple videos ago if people would be interested in seeing me show off this save in a video, much like I did with my Boston Red Sox save that I had a couple of years ago that I think I was all the way into like the 2070s in. This one not quite as expansive as that one, but still, I got enough feedback. It wasn't really overwhelming by any means, but enough people expressed some interest in seeing it, so I decided, hey, why not? This is a relatively easy video for me to make, so I decided, as I said, why not? So I guess the first thing we will do is go to the history. You guys can see basically how I've done over the years, and I can sort of try and recall the narrative of this team as it has gone on. So year number one, we enjoyed some moderate success, 85 wins. Relatively at league average run differential, but we were just able to squeak into the playoffs as the second wildcard team that year at 85 and 77. I played that year much like I played year one in my Mets save, where we were kind of a borderline wildcard contender, and the only moves I made at the deadline were acquiring relatively cheap rentals that I had to give up, little to nothing for. So pretty similar to the moves I made, like for DJ LeMahieu, or even Dylan Betances. I know Betances is not really a rental, but similar sort of low risk and low reward moves. So I guess the Betances move was a little bit higher risk, higher reward. But the DJ LeMahieu one is a good one to compare with. I think I must have traded for a starter, and I can't even remember, to be honest. I think I've actually clicked on the team. I can find out. This was one of the really good trades I made early on, when I traded for Miguel Andujar. See if I can pull up his history. Um, I got him and I got someone else. I got him and I got Durbin Feldman and Johnny Lasagna in exchange for B.J. Boyd, Mark Canha, Jonah Heim, and Bruce Maxwell. And Duhar became a contributor for me that year. I ended up flipping him not too long thereafter because, of course, I had Matt Chapman, who I kind of decided I wanted to build around. I didn't really have a spot for Andujar. I think I maybe considered DHing him, but I think I made another move in that offseason that sort of filled that role for me. But he's had a pretty solid career. He's a pretty decent bat. His career 107 OPS plus, and he plays a solid third base. So he would have been a fine starter for us at third base if we had decided to hold on to him. But I also got Durbin Feldman, who became a pretty good reliever for me. He had a few seasons where he was pretty consistently an above average reliever. ERA right around 3 each year. I never really used him in a setup role, but I would pretty consistently go to him in high leverage middle relief spots. And then he sort of started struggling in 2024, and you can see I even sent him down to the minor leagues at one point because he was struggling so bad. You can see the walks had kind of spiked, and they had been increasing over the years. But after that, I shipped him off to Toronto. And the other big piece I got in that deal was Johnny Lasagna. So he was a really effective pitcher for me for most of his career, kind of a swing guy. I initially had him in the starting rotation because I was pretty short on starters, and he kind of struggled in that role. But once I moved him to the bullpen, you can see his numbers really jumped in 2020, and that was mainly due to the 30-something relief appearances that I gave him. And yeah, I mean, really low whip, good peripherals. And then, 2021, I used him again a little bit more as a starter, and he was pretty solid for me. Nothing spectacular, but I mean, look at the strikeout to walk numbers these last couple years. Just really impressive stuff. And then I think it was this year, 2022, that he unfortunately shredded his elbow and needed Tommy John surgery. He was in the midst of a very solid year out of our bullpen, and then once he came back, he was never really the same. So, kind of an unfortunate short Oakland A's career for Lasagna. Could have been a lot better, but yeah, that was one of the first really good trades that I made. And then that offseason, this was another big trade that I made. I dealt Chris Davis, Andrew Triggs, Phil Maton, Matan, I don't know, and Herschel Boog Powell to the Indians, and I got Francisco Mejia out of it. So at the end of that offseason, I had Jonathan Lucroy, who was coming off of a very successful year. He's pretty highly rated in this game, and he consistently has good seasons early on in the saves. And I ended up deciding not to re-sign him because he was looking for, upwards of $20 million a year. So I was on the hunt for a long-term solution at the catcher position, and I think Davis was a free agent in maybe 1 or 2 years, and he had a pretty good year for me in year number one. He did pretty much had a very typical Chris Davis year, 42 home runs, and the slash line right around what it usually is. And then I ended up shipping him off, and he had a pretty successful Cleveland career. You could see he was a productive bat for them, still hit for lots of power. Um, but I knew, he was in his 30s already. His defense wasn't going to be getting any better, and it wasn't that good in the first place. So I felt that he was pretty expendable at that point. He was the biggest piece. Andrew Triggs was another relatively big piece, controllable starting pitcher. And Phil Matan, I actually had gotten him from San Diego initially, and this was probably the piece I wanted to hang on to the most. So you can see I had acquired him that offseason from San Diego, and I wanted to hold on to him because I really liked the strikeout numbers. I thought he was going to be a pretty good reliever, and but it was worth giving him up to get Mejia. Mejia, I think, is still a member of the team. Um, yeah, and he's been very successful. And in the 1 year that I won the World Series with this group, he had some of the biggest hits in that postseason run. Um, I wonder if I can see his postseason stats. So yeah, other than this 1 year, he's been really, really good in the postseason every single year, and his career postseason line is very fantastic, slugging almost near 600 in the OPS in the 900s. So um, just really, really good stuff. His defense is kind of starting to slip a little bit, and I did re-sign him to a long-term contract. He was one of the first players I gave a long-term contract to. Um, in this year's game, as opposed to previous year's games, I don't really go for the extensions once guys hit arbitration like I used to, because I think the player ratings are a little bit more volatile in this year's game. But I actually signed Mejia when he was 1 year away from free agency, I think. And maybe he was 2 years away. I think I gave him 5 years. Maybe I just re-signed him last offseason, honestly. I don't even remember. But yeah, I gave him a relatively big contract, and um, he hasn't done anything to let me down yet. He's having a pretty good year in the midst of this 2025 campaign. So those were some of the early trades that really shaped this team, and you can see right in year two we made a jump to becoming one of the elite teams in the league. But despite that, we really continued to struggle in the postseason. So, and you can see these first few years we were outperforming our run differential. So I really attributed that to Bob Melvin, and despite the fact that through these first 3 years, we did not win a single playoff game. We lost in the wild card in 2018. We got swept in the division series in 2019, and then lost in the wild card again in 2020. So you can see we finished 5 games back here of what I assume was another really good Houston Astros team. And yeah, we hadn't won a playoff game, but I saw that we were consistently outperforming our run differential, so I decided, all right, I'm going to stick with Bob Melvin. He's got a good reputation. In general, I think he's a pretty good manager in real life. And so I didn't really have any hesitation about that. But then 2021 and 2022, I really started to get a little bit. I was a little bit lower on Melvin at that point, because now we were underperforming our run differential, and we still hadn't won a single postseason game. I think maybe we won one game in the division series in 2022, but we still lost in the division series. I don't know if I can see our postseason. Um, I don't think I can. Maybe I could do. No, I don't think so. So anyway, but I know through the first 4 seasons at least, we didn't win a single postseason game, and until the year we actually won the World Series, we had never even been to the championship series, the LCS. So it was a struggle, and I seriously considered replacing Melvin after 2022. I really thought long and hard about it. I think he only had 1 year left on his deal, but I decided to stick with him, and it all paid off in 2023. We had our best year yet, 108 wins, and we ended up winning the World Series finally in pretty dominant fashion. And you can see some of the guys on this team. Jordan Adele was one of my favorite players I actually had, because he's not very highly rated, but he is effective in this game. Obviously, what I loved about him was the elite defense that he plays in the outfield. But I think I found in this year's game that the home run rating is probably the most important offensive statistic. And a guy like Adele, who is below average or just average at everything else offensively, can actually still be a relatively productive offensive player if he has that good home run rating. So let's look at his batting stats in the regular season. And you can see when we had him, he had a 101 OPS plus in 2022 and then a 96 OPS plus in 2023. And that was playing about 100 games each year for us. Um, and you can see he was having a really good year before we traded for him when he was with the Angels. So he was actually one of my favorite players that I had on a couple of those teams. And then Ronald Boyd Nia was my trade deadline acquisition that year. I was looking for a DH and an infielder. I think he eventually turned into my DH, but I think at the time my second baseman might have been hurt. And he was pretty undervalued. He was on the trade block. I was surprised to see it. He was having a really good year for Chicago. So I scooped him up. Didn't really perform that well for us, and then I ended up flipping him. I'll talk more about this Atlanta trade because this was the all-time OOTP trade, easily the best trade, probably the biggest trade I've ever made in this game, and it was completely cheesing the trade system. So anyway, this mode that I did was not in challenge mode, so the trading difficulty was just average and not hard, like I have it set to in the Mets Dynasty. So the trades were a little bit easier to manipulate. But Joey Gallo was another trade deadline acquisition that year. Again, looking for a bat, just looking to solidify the lineup a little bit. And yeah, you can see here he actually didn't really hit that well for us, and his ratings since have really declined. He got a pretty big contract after he left us. He was a rental, so I only had him for half a year before he hit free agency. And yeah, this looks a little bit weird here. What actually happened was I think before I had an opportunity to save the game after I initially won the World Series, my game like crashed and I had to go back to like June, and I kind of forced the trades that happened that I had made like for Gallo. So I had initially traded for him from Texas, and but then by the time I got to July 30th when I was redoing it, he had been swapped for JP Crawford. So I just sort of went into commissioner mode, manipulated a few things, and tried to get it back to as close to what it was originally before the game had crashed. And then I was actually lucky enough to win the World Series my first time through. When I initially did it, we did not win 108 games. I think we only won like 98, 99 games, and then it was a little bit tighter in the postseason. But for some reason, when I went back and redid it, I was planning on just redoing it as many times as it took for me to win the World Series, because I had endured a lot of frustration at that point, up to that point with this save, losing in the postseason year after year. So I was ready to do whatever it took to get that World Series that had wrongly been taken away from me by the game crashing back in my hands. So, but luckily, like my team just dominated, August and September, and then I think we went something like 11-1 in the playoffs when I redid the simulation. So I didn't even have to do it more than once, which kind of solidified to me that this was my best team. But looking at some of the other pieces, Greg Diekman, he was a offense first bat. Not great ratings, but we kind of used him in between the bench and starter role. You can see like 2022, the year we won, he had a really good year, and then the next year he was worth -2 wins, and then bounced back the following year. So he's kind of an interesting player to have on the team. But another example of someone just having a good home run rating, and he's got a couple other good ratings too, which makes him a little bit better of an offensive player than Adele was. But you can see like pretty underwhelming overall ratings, but still a pretty productive offensive piece for us over the years. And some other pieces, you can see Feldman, Judson Fabian I got from the Angels. He turned into a stud. I think I might have gotten him when he was a prospect. Yeah, I did. And in 2022, he played about 80 games for us. Wasn't really that great, but he broke out in 2023 and has been relatively productive player for us since then. And he's got a lot of team control left still. So I think I might have gotten him in the same trade I got Adele in. And Ryan Feldner, this was the first draft pick that ever actually worked out for me. And he's become, ratings-wise, he's supposed to be really good, but he's never really lived up to it, quite honestly. You can see the last 2 years, the ERA hovering around 5. And he was actually a 7th-round pick, but he turned out to be kind of a stud for us. And he had a couple good years, and now he's kind of, looks like the home run ball has been giving him an issue. But Anyway, still another one of my favorite players from this save, just because he was pretty much my first homegrown player that I was actually really able to draft and develop, and I always sort of have an affection for those guys over some others. And then Logan Gilbert was another young starter. He actually won the Cy Young for me this year in 2023, but that was mainly due to having an extremely low BABIP. But I got him in a trade from the Red Sox that I made year after winning the World Series. Luis Gonzalez, he was a pretty solid corner outfielder for me. Numbers don't overwhelm you, but I kind of used him in between the bench and a starter role. You can see he mainly got starts these 2 years, and then since then I've kind of moved him back into a bench role. But yeah, he's a pretty solid player. He's got good ratings, good contact, and good avoid Ks. Alex Lange, he was a guy I traded for from the Cubs. I actually had Luis Castillo, and then I flipped him for Lange, and Castillo proceeded to just break out. I think he might have won the Cy Young one year for the Cubs, so it's kind of a net loss for us trade-wise, but Lange has been pretty successful. Took him a little while to break out, especially as a starter. I've moved him to the bullpen these 2 years, and that's when he really seemed to find his groove. And then since he's been moved back to the rotation, last year he led the AL in ERA. This year not quite as successful, but still got a 109 ERA plus, even though his ERA is 4.69. So that's one thing I've noticed is that this league in particular has become extremely offense happy, more so than in real life. And I think that from what I've noticed, it seems that there are more home runs, like the way baseball has been trending the last few years, but the strikeout numbers have not been trending that same way. So you have guys hitting more home runs and not striking out as much as you see in real life. So that leads to a lot of offense in this game. This was a big trade I made the year that I ended up winning the World Series. This was a deadline deal. I made a lot of moves at deadline, but you can see I gave up a ton of prospects. I had Bo Bichette at the time, who was kind of an underperforming alleged stud. Ruiz, who was a cost-controllable starter. I had Cody Bellinger, who I had traded for the offseason before, but he had been having a disappointing year for me. So I really shuffled around the roster at that trade deadline, and I got Travis Shaw to sort of fill Bellinger's role. Um, and he was a free agent at the end of the year. He ended up going back to Boston, and he was okay for us in the half season that we had him. But it was really getting Royce Lewis that I cared about because at that point, um, I was looking for a shortstop. I'll explain why I was looking for a shortstop in a sec. But I was looking for a shortstop who could play some good defense for me, and he's really been an effective player for me since I've gotten him. The bat has been hot and cold, but the defense is always really steady. You can see last year he had a 6.5 win year. Definitely his best season. Um, and I also got Jose Ramirez that same year. I finally got rid of Matt Chapman. So Chapman had been a pretty effective player for us, but was starting to decline a little bit as he reached 30 years old. And I ended up deciding to flip him for Jose Ramirez, who was seemed like he was going to be a more productive player at the time, and he had one more year of control left. So I did that deal, and you can see it worked out. Of course, I got a World Series out of it with him as one of my starting infielders, and he was a pretty productive player for me while I did have him. And Chapman, I kind of want to look at Chapman's numbers. Where is he? Here he is. So Chapman ended up, his best year was probably actually he was pretty steady the first few years we had him. He was never a high OBP guy. This was his best year, 2021. He finally became a little bit better of an all-around offensive player, hitting for a higher average that led to a higher OBP. And he was a consistent, 30 home run guy for us. He had 53 the first year, which actually led the league, and then kind of settled into. He got hurt this year. He was on pace to hit like 45, I think, this year before he got hurt towards the end of the season. But he was always a big home run threat. And then in the year that we traded him, you can see he was really starting to struggle. And he has had one good year since then. He's having a good year this year. So he's been pretty up and down since we got rid of him. So I felt pretty good about that move. And this was the big piece, getting Manny Machado. So I signed Machado after the first season because he was coming off of a year where he only had a 101 OPS plus. So I actually got him on a bargain contract. I signed him for, see if I can find it. I know what it is, but I just want to find it. Here it is, 6 years, 90 million, and he was worth that and then some. Look at the seasons he had for us. I think he won MVP this first year with us. He had a 7.5 win year, and then he was worth 6 wins, 5.5, 6 wins, 6 wins, and 6 wins. Actually 6.7. But then he just became too rich for our blood, and I knew I wasn't gonna be able to afford him after this year. But my move trading for Royce Lewis corresponded with me moving Machado off of shortstop and back on a third base. So in real life, Machado, pretty below average as a defensive shortstop, but in this game, he was pretty highly rated. I think he was 55, maybe 60 grade over the course of when I was deploying him at shortstop, which is above average to good. And when I decided to trade for Royce Lewis, it was basically me deciding that I wanted to move Machado to third base, and that's actually what led to the Matt Chapman trade. So I knew for a while I had Machado at shortstop and Chapman at third, but Chapman had been struggling offensively and Machado's defense had been declining. So I decided I was going to move Machado to third base, try to go get a shortstop, and then I played Jose Ramirez at second base for the remainder of the season. So that 2022 trade deadline was just huge for us, and yeah, it really helped shape the eventual World Series winner. And some other pieces, Matt Olsen, I actually had been holding on to him up until he hit free agency, and I was thinking about re-signing him even, but then he just had a monster year in his contract year. He had 45 home runs, slugged 619, OBP was almost 400. It was far and away the best year he had ever had with us. So at that point, he became a $30 million a year player according to the St. Louis Cardinals. So I definitely wasn't going to be paying him that. But you can see before that he had been a pretty solid first baseman, around 3 wins each year, and he always hit for a ton of power, so I never had any problems with him. And then going back to some of the pitchers I had, Michael Baez was another guy I traded for from San Diego. He was a pretty disappointing prospect, but he actually became a relatively solid reliever for us. I decided I was going to move him to the bullpen, and he was up and down, but he had a couple decent years like 2024, and even this year, he's actually having a pretty solid season. He's finally got the home run ball down. That's pretty much his biggest issue. His movement rating is terrible, but kind of an interesting player that I had. And then Joey Luchessi was another really interesting player. I got him from San Diego in that same deal that I got Phil Maton for. And at this point, I was just looking for cost controllable starting. And then he really has pitched above expectations ever since I've gotten him. Just really, really solid. ERAs typically in the mid threes. He had this one kind of outlier, really bad year. But other than that, just really, really solid stuff. Nothing spectacular, but always very, very solid in the middle of a rotation. And last year he had his best year, 2.94 ERA, thanks to the low BABIP. This year, kind of coming back to earth, he's got a 4.50 ERA right now, but another one of my favorite players from the save, just because he's been so reliable over the course of the years. And then I had Severino for this 1 year. I traded for him. He was a guy that was undervalued because he was coming off of Tommy John, so I got him for relatively cheap. And his ratings aren't the best in this game because his movement rating is not very good. So you can see the stats that he had for us. The home run ball was really an issue for him, and he was solid ERA in the mid to upper threes, but I eventually shipped him. Actually, I didn't ship him back to New York. He became a free agent, and then he went back to New York as a free agent in the 2023-24 offseason. So kind of an interesting career that he had for us. But and then another guy that we had that I was never able to win a World Series with, unfortunately, was James Paxton. So I had Paxton up until maybe even how long did I have Paxton for? So something that happened in this game was after the first year, they extended the number of years that players needed to reach free agency to 7. So I made the move for James Paxton, I think, maybe even before that they instituted that. I'm trying to see. I might have done that. I did that at the 2019 trade deadline, and then I think maybe they instituted that rule after that season. So I basically had him for 1 more year than I thought I was going to have him. I thought I was only going to have him for 1.5 years. I ended up having him for 2.5. He was a little bit underwhelming for us the first couple years, but then this contract year he had was really spectacular, and I sort of always envisioned him being the ace that we would have at the front of a rotation. And yeah, he won the Cy Young actually that year, his contract year with us, 2021. And I always sort of envisioned him as the ace that would carry us through a postseason, but it just never was to be. He never was really that effective for us in the postseason, whether that be, um, anything more than just randomness. And then you can see the other moves that I made at that deadline. I got a couple big relievers. Kimbrel and Jansen were deadline pickups in that 2023 season, and they both played pretty big roles for us. See some other guys I had. I think I had Glasnow as another kind of swing guy, between back and forth between the bullpen and the rotation. Carson Fulmer, same thing. He actually got hurt for us. I traded. He's always kind of been like a three-star player in this game, so it wasn't that big of a deal when I traded for him. And you can see he was pretty solid for us, mainly pitching out of the bullpen though. And then he's had a couple good years for Washington since being traded to them. I don't remember what I got back in that trade, but anyway, and I had Chasen Shreve. He's always a pretty effective lefty in this game. He was my big lefty I had in the bullpen. I had Roberto Osuna. I think that was another trade deadline pickup. I think that's actually who I shipped Feldman off to Toronto for. And then Jared Miller, another good lefty that I had for a number of years. You can see I had him for 5 seasons, I think. And after a rocky start to his A's career, he really settled into being one of the premier left-handed relievers in the game before he signed with Washington after last year. And I honestly should have just re-signed him because he got nothing for a contract, but that was a mistake on my part. And that's pretty much it for the story of this World Series winning team. So then the last thing I think I'll talk about is what led me to winning 118 games the next year, and that was making this absolutely ridiculous trade with the Atlanta Braves. And this is the trade I alluded to earlier, the best trade I've made in this game. It was not even close to being fair. So I threw in Ronald Boyd Nia, who I talked about a little bit already, as well as Johnny Lasagna. Same thing, talked about him already. Logan Allen, who I had originally gotten off the Rule 5 draft from the Padres, and he had been a relatively effective swingman for us, made some starts, mainly appeared out of the bullpen, and he was pretty effective as a lefty, so there is some value in that. And he still has a few years of control left. And Allan Houston, who I think was a prospect, you can see he is decent little starting prospect, but probably not going to be anything because his movement rating is so low. And one more, Zack Davies, who I had traded for from Milwaukee, and I had actually gotten Milwaukee to retain most of the salary on him, so I was only paying him like $3 million a year, but we had given him 2 seasons, and he had really not done much for us. He had been, actually he hadn't even really been that effective. I don't know why I wanted to trade for him, quite honestly. I think I just liked the fact that his control was so high. But yeah, and the haul I got back was unreal. So the biggest asset was Ozzie Albies because he still had a couple years of team control left, and then I ended up re-signing him, I think, to this big contract. And I mean, he's just a stud. He had 6, 7 win seasons for Atlanta. Kind of fell off the year before I traded for him, and he actually hasn't really lived up to that hype. He was a 4-win, 3.5, 4-win player the first year we had him, and he's kind of struggling this year too. So it'll be interesting to see if he ever really regains that form that he had when he was putting up 7-win seasons. But his ratings are still really high, so there's no reason that he can't, at least in my eyes. And then Dinelson Lamet, who was on a contract. He had a player opt-out after this one season that he had with us, and he was really effective that year. So, of course, he ended up opting out and signed a big free agent contract with the Diamondbacks. But he was pretty effective for us the 1 year we had him. You can see really solid year, 3.63 ERA, low WHIP, 3-win pitcher. And then the biggest name out of all these, Bryce Harper. So Harper, just easily one of the best bats in this game, in this save. Actually kind of underwhelming year for us, but he still opted out. So he had another contract that had an opt-out after that year. And I guess Albies must have been the same way. I think he had been extended, but he also had an opt-out. So that was kind of the thing about that trade, was there was a lot of guys that had opt-outs after 1 year. And look, I mean, the year he was coming off of 7.5 wins, led the league in OBP and slugging. And you can see, I mean, he had just been putting up ridiculous seasons in this save. So I was really excited to trade for him, and he was kind of underwhelming, honestly. I mean, 889 OPS, that's obviously still really good, but I mean, based on the years that he was putting up, that was his lowest OPS since 2020, and before that, his lowest since 2016. So a little bit of a disappointing run that he had with us, and ended up signing with the Mets that offseason. So we only got 1 year out of him, and then AJ Minter, another guy that we only got 1 year out of. So that's the thing about that trade. We only got 1 year out of a bunch of those guys. We didn't really give up much, but when you have the trade difficulty on average, the game really devalues 1 year rental players. So that's kind of how I was able to take advantage, getting all those good players for, very, very little. And Minter is simply one of the best relievers in this game. You can see by the ratings, but just look at the numbers he's put up last few years. And he's left-handed, so another one of the premier lefties in the game. Look at the WARs. I mean, to put up 2 and 3 win seasons as a relief pitcher is pretty insane. This one in particular is just absurd. Almost a 4-win year in 2020. So anyway, he signed with Houston in the offseason, and yeah, so that was the big trade. It was pretty crazy, but we lost 3 of those guys after 1 season. So it worked out. I mean, it helped us win 118 games, and we were the best team in the league this past season, 2024. But we ended up breaking the all-time wins record, which I put some significance into, because I think if you're the best regular season team like that, it's almost more impressive than just being able to win a bunch of short 5 and 7 game series. Because to be able to do it over 162 games and be far and away the best team ever, not far and away the best team ever, but far and away the best team in the league, and to break that wins record, I think that's pretty cool. So I was happy to do that. I think we ended up losing in the division series that year though. So this is still the only year we've even gotten out of the division series. The 1 year we won the World Series, but. Anyway, so that pretty much does it for showing off this save. If you guys have any more questions about it, if there were players that you were curious about that I sort of glossed over, I'd be happy to talk more about it in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Hope you did enjoy, and as I'm out. Peace.